Growing Together, a gardening podcast, is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Salem, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 at Exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinzler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how you doing?
I am doing great, especially since we've had temperatures in the 70s. I've been out walking around our yard and garden, not just walking around. I've been removing the dead tops off of perennials, and I've just been soaking it all up.
And it is. It's just nice to be out in the sun, and it's nice to, it's actually nice to be out in the sun, but then to able to get down and do some work. You can't, we're not necessarily doing planting yet. Here we are in the first week of May.
Lots of cleanup.
Yeah, but we could do cleanup, and that makes it look nice.
Yeah, it does. And I think I am enjoying this spring, just watching things grow, watching the trees bud out, the perennials popping up out, the shrubs starting to leaf out. I think I'm enjoying it more this year than ever because we waited so long.
Yeah.
6 months without did you hear that statistic? 6 months without a 70-degree day.
Yeah, that was, and
it's been a long time coming.
As somebody who likes to grill out, it's also really nice too because then I can get the grill started and I can, in between, I can walk around while waiting for the grill to heat up. I can walk around the garden and kind of take a look at things and
see what's coming.
See what's coming, see where there are spaces, and for me, it's also like looking at an area and thinking like, what was there? What something is coming up there, and what's it going to be? I've got to be better about keeping photos and keeping notes on that and
labeling. I love putting a label by the stuff because then if something is slow or you just kind of can't see that anything was there, at least you know there's something that should be there.
Yeah. Hey, I tell you, we have a new neighbor. He dug a hole in his backyard and filled it full of water. I think he meant well. So I bring that one up. I use that one because today we're going to be talking about planting, and planting is just more than digging a hole.
It is, and of course, the spring planting season is upon us.
Yeah, really, what do you say? Your guideline, kind of your rule of thumb, is what, May 15th?
Well, yeah, for anything that is in full leaf, and that would be frost sensitive, that in full leaf that frost would kill. I like the 10-day window between May 15th and May 25th because frost is much less likely and the soil has had a chance to warm up. And so that's the 10-day window that I look at. It doesn't mean we can't have frost after that date, but anything that we buy right now in the garden center, it's fun to shop now at our garden centers because they're full and, the selection is good and everything. And so we can buy now. We don't necessarily have to plant now. A question that I oftentimes get before we get into the actual meat of the planting. Okay, when we buy things at the garden center and bring on home, if we aren't quite ready to plant yet, what do? We used to be asked in the garden center a lot, is it okay to keep these in the garage for a week or two? I'm not ready to plant. And the answer is no, because they'll languish inside a dark garage. These plants were grown in bright light, bright greenhouses or trees and shrubs outdoors. So put them outdoors in a protected spot, but give them some sun. That'll harden them off. So all of the materials that we're going to talk about planting, if they're in full leaf, there's still danger of frost. We might not, but most maize from May, from May 5th on, there's still a pretty good chance of, and that's the date we're taping this today is May 5th, there's still a pretty good chance we'd get at least a frost or two.
You used the term hardening off in reference to plants. What exactly does that mean?
Toughening them up. Okay. Because when plants come out of a greenhouse, they're kind of, they've been sheltered and ideal growing conditions. And if we just plant them out, sometimes that shock can cause some sun damage, wind damage. But if we harden them off, toughen them up, kind of by putting them in a little bit of a sheltered location outside, before we plant them, for a week or so, week and a half, and gradually expose them to a little more sunlight, natural sunlight, a little more air, a little more wind, and then the shock of planting will be less.
All right.
So hardening off is the term used for getting them accustomed to outdoors.
Well, so I think one of the big things that one of the first things people look at when they get into the growing season is their lawn. And
that's been fun to see the lawns. I can't wait to mow.
Yes, legitimately one of my neighbors did mow, I think earlier this week, and I was like, no, nothing's really growing yet. Nothing's grown up
He's
yet.
Maybe practicing,
and I think they did it more to clean up. So okay, that's fine. But so if people have an area that they need to seed, or if they have a whole yard they need to seed, what should people be doing there?
These last couple of hot summers have been hard on lawns because, as we've discussed before, our lawns are cool season type grasses, and so they've thinned out. So if we have areas that have been thinned, either just because from the heat or vole damage, things like that, bare spots, the time to seed is when the soil temperature has reached 50 degrees. Now I checked, and with our warmer temperatures, our soil temperatures in much of the state and in western Minnesota are about 50 degrees or so. So I think we could right now be planting grass seed.
Okay.
So now if it's a brand new bare area, follow the directions on the grass seed. It should be at least 50% Kentucky bluegrass type. So look at the label. You kind of get what you pay for. This isn't the time to, be chintzy on it. So buy the good stuff. And then following the label directions as to how much to apply it onto your lawn. And so if you're overseeding into, kind of a bare lawn, but you don't want to just rototill it all up, but you're seeding, okay, so just sprinkle it on. There's usually a rate for overseeding, which is a heavier rate because it's got to filter down through the existing grass. So use the heavier rate of application. And grass seed needs light to germinate. So grass seed isn't planted down like we would bean seed or pea seed in the vegetable garden. So you've done it right when after the grass seed is planted, you can still see most of it. So in preparation, maybe rake it up good so that there's a little bit of contact with the soil, and then seed your grass seed and maybe go over it again with the rake. And then the single most important thing is to water it in well and keep it evenly moist as you can, which usually means 1 or 2 waterings a day to keep that surface moist.
And when you talk about watering, what's your trick? We've talked about this on the show. I love this one.
I love it. Okay, how much water are you applying? The tuna can method or a straight-sided soup can, that will let you know how much. So the first watering should be at least 1 inch to get a good base of moisture. And then to get grass seed to sprout, really watering a couple of times a day, but that only has to be to keep the surface moist. So your tuna can doesn't have to fill up. You just maybe like 1/10 of an inch or so to keep that surface moist.
And you talked a little bit about overseeding. And so for people who are overseeding, this is when you have maybe a lawn, but there may be some spots, or maybe
you're seeding into existing grass that's just thin.
Yeah. And so when you talked about like you want a heavier application, but do you also want to get out the rake then and kind of, because some of it may be caught up on top of grass. You can't grow grass on top of grass.
Sure.
You need the contact with the soil. Do you want to get out there with the rake again and kind of rake it out evenly?
Yep, exactly. Yep. So you would begin the process by giving it a good heavy raking to try to get some of the old fluff and stuff out of the grass so that the grass seed will actually come in contact with some soil.
So really kind of clean up at first.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. What about trees? The other thing that I'm looking out, some of my trees are starting to bud, and I know I've got to go out and get the fight at the chlorosis. I've got to use chelated iron on my maple tree.
Sure, for the iron chlorosis, sure.
So, but anyway, so the trees, when planting trees, because it's better to plant trees in the spring and in the fall, right?
It is, yep. And so we're in a good time to plant trees now. If they were fully leafed, sometimes from a garden center, the trees will have been advanced, maybe in a greenhouse or brought in from somewhere where it was a little warmer. The trees may be in full leaf. So do be cautious, because if there's frost in the forecast, those leaves would be frozen as well. So what I like to do is buy the trees even now in earlier part of May, but maybe wait to plant a little bit. It may mean you need to water them each day or so. So let's talk about planting a tree.
Yeah.
All right. So you've got the tree, and the hole should be probably at twice as wide as the pot is, at least. Common question is, should you add stuff down in the bottom of the hole. Should you add peat moss? When you dig the hole, should you add peat moss and things? And the answer is no. The reason for that is tree roots need to go out into the existing soil. And if you make the soil too wonderful, beautiful, compost, and the roots will stay there and won't want to go out into the rest of your non-amended soil. So no, just use the soil that you've got. Dig it out, and that's what you'll backfill with. So no need for peat moss or anything else in trees. Okay, so let's talk about the actual planting. So we've got the tree, we've got the hole dug at least twice as wide as the pot diameter. Okay, so the first thing I like to do is water that tree pot well, because that makes it easier to slip it out. And then you're going to make sure that will be sure then that the roots and everything are hydrated and that. So slip the tree out of its pot, and usually it'll come out fine. Just tip the tree on its side a little bit, or even just give a little pull, and it'll come out. You oftentimes don't need to cut away the pot. You can, or run a knife around the inside inside perimeter of the pot. That'll work too. So when you get the tree out of the pot, take a look. Are there big circling roots? In most cases there are. The roots will be circling around. And if you planted the tree as is, which used to be the recommendation used to be don't disturb the roots because, you disturb the roots. So, but what they found was that 15, 20 years down the road, those roots continued to grow in a circle and they choked the tree like a boa constrictor. So based on lots of trees dying as a result, the recommendation, very important, is to take that root ball with all those circling roots and do one of a couple things, or maybe a combination. You can take a sharp knife and just cut straight down in about 4 areas, cut straight down through all those circling roots and also on the bottom, or tease those circling roots outward. So they're going to go out and not continue growing in a circle like that. So very important to eliminate those circling roots.
So if you use the blade method and you cut down in those 4 lines, are you cutting off roots? Is that bad for the tree?
There's going to be some roots that will be cut off, but the danger from that, any adverse effects of that, are minimal compared to if you let those roots circle. So yeah, you're doing some disturbance to the root system, but that is insignificant to the danger that the roots could cause. So in addition to eliminating the circling roots, the next part is to make sure that the tree is at the proper depth.
Yeah.
And we've really become aware of that because we used to plant trees too deeply. And what they would do 15, 20 years down the road, they start to decline. So how do you know the proper depth of a tree? Okay, the depth is gauged by the uppermost, what's called the flare root. So in the pot, look for the first big root that's coming off of the trunk. Now, the tree may not have been planted at the proper depth in the pot. So you can't just plant the tree at the same depth it is in the pot, because what if it was planted too deep in the pot? Okay, so at the top of the soil surface of the pot, tease away some of that dirt and look for that first big main root. It's the type of thing where you dig down and you say, oh, now I see what Kinzler was talking about. There's that first root.
You'll know it when you see it.
You'll know it when you see it. And that should be just below the final planted surface. Okay, so when you're digging the depth of the hole, experiment a little, set the tree down in, see if you've got the right depth. If it's too deep, add a little more in the bottom of the hole, or if it's not deep enough, dig a little deeper. And so the final result should be so that uppermost big root coming off the trunk is just below soil surface. And that's very, very important. So then when you get the tree situated down in, backfill with the soil that you dug out, and it should just be at a slight depression so that when you water, the water will kind of hold there. So if I'm painting the picture then of the final planted tree has just a slight saucer around it.
Okay.
And then immediately after planting, water very, very well. Use the garden hose to soak it down. If you were going to do it by the bucket method, at least 2 5-gallon buckets of water. You need to eliminate all the pockets of air and get good soil to root contact. And so the equivalent on most young trees, a couple of 5-gallon buckets. That's quite a bit of water.
Yeah.
But that's good. That will get it off to a good start.
So if when you do that, and because you want to have the top of that root, kind of showing, when you water it so much, there will be some soil will compact and some soil it'll settle, right?
It will.
So then you'll have maybe a little bit more root showing. I know some places suggest maybe putting some wood chips or something around it.
So
Thoughts?
if the soil settles down and if that first root is exposed, then add a little more soil to the top so that uppermost flare root is still covered. Also, another gauge of the proper planting depth is what's called the flare, where the trunk of the tree goes into the soil. There's usually, if you visualize trees, they don't usually go into the soil like a telephone pole. There's usually that slight flared out portion at the soil surface, and that flared out portion should be visible. Now, you mentioned mulch. Yeah, very important on trees because a mulch around trees will do a couple of great things. It'll help conserve moisture. It'll keep the roots a little cooler during hot weather, and it'll make mowing so much easier.
Yeah.
You won't be scarring that little sensitive tree with the lawnmower. I like the 5-5-5 rule of mulching, and that's I should mention the material. I like the shredded wood material.
Okay.
And shredded wood kind of meshes together good. You can buy bags of it. Sometimes you can buy it bulk from garden centers. So 5-5-5, that's a circle 5 foot in diameter.
Okay.
And 5 inches thick.
Okay.
Of mulch because it's going to settle a little, and then kept 5 inches away from the trunk. So it shouldn't be right up to the trunk, but 5 inches away so the trunk doesn't rot.
Yeah, so the trunk's not getting that extra moisture on the surface there, like right on the bark.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, a lot of good information there. We're going to take a quick little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about fruit trees and then also get into some flowers and shrubs.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back and we're talking about how to plant plants. Planting things in your yard. We've talked how to plant grass seed. We've talked about trees. We're going to talk about fruit trees now, because fruit trees are just a little bit different. There's a lot of the same information, but a little bit different.
Right. The basic information of planting a fruit tree is much like we just described for planting shade-type trees, with one exception. Fruit trees are grafted, and the graft is that knobby part that you'll see between the upper trunk and the roots. There's kind of a dog leg in there, and that's the graft, where the good fruiting portion was grafted onto a hardy rootstock. And that grafted portion should be visible above ground level. So when you plant the apple tree or fruit tree, plum tree, just make sure that that's above and then follow the other procedures. Also, I should mention that as I did with trees, when you're just ready to plant that tree, water the tree in its pot. That just makes it so much easier to get it out of the pot.
Yeah, like you said, to slide it right out.
Yeah, it'll slide right out if you've watered beforehand. And then you make sure that soil ball is hydrated.
How high above the ground do you want the knob to be? Because if we're how high, I should just ask.
Check again for that flare root, that first root, and you'll find that on the apple tree, and that will naturally give the graft above. So sometimes the grafts are fairly low on the trunk. Sometimes they'll be maybe 6 inches high, where you'll see that dog leg.
Okay, and shrubs. These are a little bit more amenable to when we can plant them. They're not quite like trees that way.
Shrubs are easier.
Shrubs are easier. We can do those pretty much almost all summer long. What should we look for when we're planting shrubs?
The planting depth on shrubs isn't as critical as it is on trees, so it's a little easier. So first of all, I like to start by watering it. Almost anything that I plant, I water it before I take it out of the pot.
Okay.
Okay, so shrubs, take it out of the pot. There will usually be circling roots around, and so I like to cut those roots or tease them outward. They don't become as massive as a tree root. So there's probably less shrubs that have died from circling roots than there are trees that have died from circling roots. But still, we don't want them just remaining in a circle. So cut them or tease them apart. Cut in 4 quadrants down through or tease them outward. And shrubs should be planted at about the same depth that they're growing in the pot. But it's important to have the final planting so that your soil covers the soil that was in the pot. So just slightly deeper. The problem is if the potted soil, the root ball, is extended above the natural soil line, moisture can wick out of that.
Okay.
And so it's important to have that soil ball that was in the pot there down below your natural soil after planting so that you don't get that wicking of moisture up and out of the planting hole.
So it's really a protective layer just on top.
Yep. And of course, if you're planting them in a landscape, you can put mulch around, as we did with trees. You can put mulch around. And also make sure to water them in really thoroughly. That watering in after planting is really important because it gets rid of the air spaces and gets the soil directly in contact with the roots.
How much water, we talked about with trees, how much you should do. What about with a shrub? And I suppose that depends on
about a 5 gallon. Yeah, it depends on the size of the shrub, but generally 3 to 5 gallons.
Okay.
I like to measure with a 5-gallon bucket, and so a shrub, nothing wrong with putting on 5 gallons, but, at least 3/4 full, 2/3 full.
And you really want to be generous when you pour it out. You don't want to just dump it over.
Exactly. Pour it on kind of a little gently so it'll soak on down in.
How about bare root shrubs? If you've got something that comes
bare root.
because
some of the nurseries do sell bare root shrubs through the month of May and partly into June. And bare root shrubs are actually a little easier because the hole, sometimes you don't have to dig it maybe quite as big. You can kind of see where those roots are, and you don't need to cut the roots so you just kind of need to feather them outward. And with those, you just backfill in around, hold it with one hand, hold the shrub with one hand, or bare root tree, and then fill in with soil around. Just making sure that the roots are outward and that they don't all end up in one clump, because they're bare root, not with soil around.
Because you don't have the actual root ball there. First of all, do you want to? I don't want to say push or press it in, but do you want to make sure it gets down in there good enough so that it gets in good contact with all the soil?
Exactly. And that's why sometimes I find it's easier to hold the plant, the upper part, with one hand and then kind of put the soil in around, instead of shoveling it in, because you kind of need to work the soil in between the roots because they're bare, so you need to kind of get that soil in there.
Do you need to stake it or anything so that it doesn't lean too much?
Yeah, that's a good question on trees. Shrubbery doesn't usually get staked, but trees, the first season, many trees, whether it's bare root or potted, should be staked, especially if it looks like they're going to lean, but just for one season until they get rooted in.
Okay, let's move on to one that for me is daunting. I haven't done it yet. I guess I'm a little nervous about it, and I don't even know if we will have the space for it. Roses. I think roses, because people may think that roses can be finicky and can be touchy, and certainly you can get hurt with rose thorns.
Yeah,
but
I wear kind of canvas gloves, leather type gloves. Actually, I bought some welding type leather gloves.
Smart.
Is they go up, almost up to your elbows.
Yeah, sure, because you're going to be in there. You're going to be arm deep in them.
Yeah, I've had too many thorns.
But so when we're planting rose bushes, how do we want to go about that? Like you said, it's good. Maybe this is something where you really want to be sure you're prepared for it.
Exactly. And now I like the Canadian developed roses to begin with. But now remember how we emphasized that trees cannot be planted too deep?
Yes.
Well, roses we want to plant deep.
Oh, really? Okay.
We do, because they're not going to adversely be affected by depth of planting the way trees are. But by planting roses deeply, it gets that crown, which is the growing point between the canes and the roots, it gets that crown down deep into more moderate winter soil.
Okay.
So if you plant them deep, it's more chance that that crown where the life comes from is going to be preserved. So 4 to 6 inches down. So you take a look on a rose bush, whether it's a bare root or a potted rose, you look for that crown, the spot where the canes kind of meet roots, and locate that crown 4 to 6 inches below your finished soil grade. And now remember when I mentioned we don't want to amend the soil of trees with anything like peat moss or anything because you want those tree roots to go out. Well, rose bushes don't go out that far.
Okay.
And so roses, we do want to amend the soil. They love peat moss or other organics. So yes, the hole that you dig for a rose in the bottom, mix in peat moss. What you fill back in, the soil you're going to fill back in, mix peat moss on in. And so that works really, really well. And so it's interesting. Roses are kind of the exception, the opposite end of the spectrum from how to plant a tree.
Talking about peat moss, and that they're beneficial with roses. Do we also want to do those with shrubs?
You could, the shrub root systems don't extend out as far as a tree. For example, if a tree is 30 feet tall, the roots are 1 to 2 times that. So a 30-foot, 40-foot the roots are out, 60, 80, 100 feet out. And so they're way beyond any amended soil. Shrubs, the root system do not go out that far. So if you're in the mood to amend some soil, shrubs you could, but they aren't usually needed. Our adapted shrubs are usually also adapted to our soil conditions.
All right, we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about perennial flowers, annual flowers, and even some fruits.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
Okay, we're back and we're talking planting, and let's talk about flowers. Let's start with perennial flowers. When we get out there and we're ready to get in the garden, how should we go about this?
Well, again, same song, next verse about watering the plants before you plant them. Like if I've got some potted perennials, I like to water it in really well right before I'm planting. They just slip out of the pot easier, and then it makes sure the root ball is hydrated. And so now perennials do like organic matter in the soil. So you could kind of amend the whole planting bed. If you've got a number of perennials, you could add 3 inches or so of peat moss over the top or compost, work that in well. Or the other alternative, if you've already got an established perennial bed and you're adding to it, well, just kind of amend that soil right around where you're going to be planting that perennial. So perennials do like peat moss and organic matter. So, amend the soil. That's always great. So we slip the perennial out of its pot, and if it's a tight mass of roots, where it's maybe been grown in that pot for quite a while, then absolutely cut those roots, tease them apart a little bit. I'm not talking about necessarily cutting so many roots away as I'm talking about just disrupting the circular pattern that they've developed so that they go outward. I like the idea of kind of teasing them outward. But in all of these planting operations, do it quickly, because when we're taking a plant out of its pot, those roots are being exposed to air, which is not good. And so the quicker we can do these planting operations, the better. So for perennials, slip them out of the pot, tease apart these encircling roots or cut them, plant it. The soil that you backfill with could be amended with some organic matter, and then water it in so thoroughly. So on any of these planting operations, I like to pretend that the plant is bleeding to death.
Okay.
So that, it's important. Roots will die when they're exposed to air. So, for example, if you pull a plant like the perennial out of its pot and then start digging the hole, it's going to be exposed to air for a long time. So the quicker you can get things done and not have those roots exposed to air, the better on all of these planting procedures. So again, perennials planted at about the same depth that they were in the pot. There's a perennial that's really sensitive to planting depth, and that is a peony.
Okay.
If peonies are planted too deep, they often will not bloom. And so how do you know how deep to plant a peony? Well, you look for the eyes, which are the buds, and the buds are located right below kind of the potting soil that it was in. So a bare root is easy, a bare root peony, and sometimes they're sold that way. Bare root peony, you can see those pointed eyes or buds just kind of right above the gnarly roots. And so those buds, or if it's potted peony, you just kind of brush aside a little of the soil and see where those pointy buds are. Even if it's a peony that's growing, you can see those buds from which the stems originated. So the bottom line on that is that those buds should be about 1.5 inches below soil surface. 1.5, at most 2 inches. The uppermost eye or bud, it sounds like a person is really getting, but it's kind of important on peonies. They're such a long-lived perennial, you wouldn't think they'd be this particular, but they kind of are. So the final uppermost bud on a peony should be about 1.5 to 2 inches below your final soil surface.
All right. How about annual flowers?
Well, annual flowers, it's fun. Peony, petunias, marigolds, salvia, all the wonderful ones. Okay. So again, I water that pack, 6-pack, 4-pack. I water those first. Then it'll come out easier. They'll be hydrated. Then, depending on how long they've been growing in that pack, they may be really, really tightly rooted or maybe not quite so rooted. If they're really tightly rooted, I like to tease those roots apart a little bit, just so they aren't in such a tight glob when you plant. And if the soil is prepared well, either in a pot or even in a ground bed, if the soil is prepared really nice, and when I say prepared nice, kind of fluffy, I don't even use a trowel. I just use my hands. I scoop out a little opening, plant that annual flower down in, and then gently firm the soil around the roots so you have kind of a good contact with that, and then water immediately. But again, a common question is, should I disturb the roots on some of those plants at all? And if they're tightly wound around in a tight little clump, I think it's important, not to totally disrupt and set the plant back into shock, but just tease those roots apart a little bit.
Well, as we work towards summer, one of the things that I think a lot of us will be thinking about is the great summer fruits. And one of the things that people can grow in their backyard or in their yard are strawberries. What about strawberries? How do we go about with plants like that, with fruit plants like strawberry?
With strawberries, the planting depth is quite important. Again, it's all about the crown. And the crown of a strawberry plant is the part between the stems and leaves and the roots. That growing point at which the new little leaves emerge is that little crown. And that crown has to be located so it's right at ground level in the finished planting. So it doesn't want to be too high out of the ground, doesn't want to be buried too deep down in the ground. So your final planted strawberry should have that little crown right at soil level.
Now, I've seen pictures, some people who are growing strawberries in window boxes and strawberries. I've seen them even in gutters, old repurposed gutters.
Sure.
With strawberries, how much soil do they need to grow in? Do they need as much depth as other plants?
6 to 12 inches would be good. Probably a minimum of 6 inches. 6 inches, 12. 12 would be probably good. 6, 8, 10 inches, they'll probably grow. The biggest trick about strawberries in containers or above ground planters is winter injury. Because the winter, the cold, frigid temperatures can penetrate the sides of that container more frigidly, is that a word? Frigidly? Yep. Than if you planted them out in the big mass of the ground. And so wintering is a little trickier. They
won't have that insulation of the ground.
Exactly. Yep. So that can be a little bit touchy.
If you were to do them
fun to try.
If you were to do them in a box, then could you bring them maybe not inside, but into the garage where it was sheltered a little bit?
Yeah, some have done that successfully. It's not always. Garages can fluctuate a little bit too, so it can be a little tricky. Some people move the planters next to the house foundation and then cover with leaves in the fall of the year. That can help too.
All right. What about vegetables? Because along with fruits,
tomatoes, America's number one vegetable for homegrown, and tomato plants are interesting. It's funny as we've been talking about these. Each of these things has their little tweak, don't they? Tweaks of planting, and of course that's why we're talking about it. It's fun to talk about them. So tomatoes is one of those that has its own kind of little peculiarities, but it's a fun peculiarity. Tomatoes have the ability to root all along the stem. And so for planting tomatoes, the best way is to take off a number of the lower leaves and plant it deeply so that lower stem is well buried in soil. Because then if you were to dig it up a month or so down the road, you'd find that stem produced lots of good roots, and more roots is good for the plant. So I like to say plant them so that plant them right up to their ears. And somebody asked me, what do you mean ears? So that just the top tuft of the plant is sticking out. It'll root along the stem, as I mentioned, but also it won't whip in the wind so much. And, of course, a lot of us grew up putting coffee cans around our tomatoes, and I actually still do that. For a week or two, it helps so that the wind doesn't whip them quite so much. But that depth of planting on tomatoes is important. Now, peppers, which are in the same family as tomatoes, but peppers don't like to be planted that deep. So peppers should be at about the same depth that they were in the little pack or pot in which you buy them, just maybe it's slightly deeper, but not deep like tomatoes. And also most of the other vegetables that you would plant out from a plant, like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, those should be planted just slightly deeper than the little soil ball that was in the pack, so that your garden soil just covers that soil, but not deep like a person would tomatoes.
How about if we're going to start from seed?
Yeah, vegetables from seed. It's interesting. There are some things that are planted quite deep, such as peas and beans, which are a larger seed, get planted at least an inch or so deep. Other seed, like carrots and lettuce, are such fine seed. And the finer the seed, the shallower they need to be planted. Otherwise, they just won't penetrate through that depth of soil. So like carrot and lettuce, radishes, just barely get covered with a little bit of soil. Carrots are tricky. And many of us have a difficult time getting carrot seed to germinate because it gets planted so shallowly and the soil can crust and that seed can have a difficult time penetrating through the soil. So some people will put a little bit of a light layer of peat moss over it. Old timers put a board plank over that area.
Really?
Yeah, it's interesting because, and of course, anybody that's had problems getting carrots to germinate right away will say, "Oh yeah, I got to hear this." And so the old timers would plant the carrot seed. Again, it gets very shallowly planted, otherwise it won't come up either. And then they'll water that down and then lay a board plank, 1x6, 1x8, whatever, over that. And that'll keep it moist. It'll keep the soil from crusting. And then but you got to check it every day because as soon as the carrots start to sprout, then you remove the board. Or you could use maybe other mulch of some sort too. But for anybody that's had a challenge getting carrots to germinate, because once they do, then you've got a pretty good crop. But you might try the old board method.
How about for some of the leafy things like spinach? And I'm no fan of kale, but I know people grow it. So I will ask for the benefit of those listeners who have kale. What should we do with those? How to go about those ones?
And the nice thing is the seed pack usually indicates how deep to plant. But some of those maybe mentioned like about a 1/4 inch. Most of us probably don't take a ruler out to see, what's a 1/4 inch on those. But a 1/4 inch is just slightly covered, drag a hoe along to make a very shallow little trench, then plant your seed and just barely covered, and that gives you about the 1/4 inch.
How about for some of the bigger the things that'll have bigger production, like pumpkins or squash, cucumbers, melons, corns?
Yes, all those seeds, fairly large, and those get planted about an inch deep. Now, you bring up an interesting point. Oftentimes, the package of pumpkin, squash, cucumbers will indicate that you can plant them in a hill.
Yeah.
And my mom would always say, we're going to plant the pumpkins in a hill. Now, it's interesting because some people say, a mound of soil would sound like a hill, but a mound of soil will quickly dry out and you get less germination. A hill is an old-time term for a grouping. So instead of planting cucumbers or pumpkin squash in just individual single seeds, the customary way was to plant them in a grouping. So plant maybe 4 or 5 pumpkin squash, cucumber seeds in a grouping, and then space those groupings so far apart, and then the vines would run. So if you see the term planting them in a hill, it doesn't mean to plant them in a little mound of soil. It just means planting them in a grouping of seeds.
How about, this is something...
I love those old gardening terms.
Yeah, the hill.
Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes they don't.
One thing that I think we're going to try to do this year is we've never done potatoes. What would you recommend for doing potatoes? Because potatoes you don't do from seeds necessarily. You do
exactly.
From starters.
It's again a garden terminology. They're called seed potatoes.
Seed potatoes.
Yeah,
yes.
and they aren't seed.
Right.
But it's funny. I love these terms. So seed potatoes are pieces of potatoes. So usually when you buy a bag of seed potatoes, you get tubers of various sizes. If they're about the size of an egg, you could plant that whole thing. If they're bigger than egg size, then you cut those tubers into seed pieces, and each piece should have at least one eye, which are the buds, and usually they've started growing. I love growing potatoes. It's fun. So you cut them up into those pieces, or if it's an egg size, you just plant the whole piece. And so potatoes, you dig your little trench. Instead of one long trench, since it gets spaced about a foot apart, I just dig like individual holes and plant them around 4 inches deep or so, depending on what type of soil you have. But around 3 to 4 inches deep is probably about ballpark. And then you drop the seed piece down in either your trench or the little hole, and plant it so that the eye is upward, because that's where it's going to, the sprout is going to grow upward. Potatoes are fascinating. I love that. That's one of my favorite crops.
Yeah, like I said, we've never done this one before, and I recently picked up at an estate sale. I found one of those big galvanized tubs.
Oh, awesome!
And so we've got
potatoes in containers. That can work very well.
Yeah, we've got a bit more room, a bit additional space to do things like that. So I think we're going to try some different vegetables this year, and potatoes might be one of them.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I love those. It's so fun in the fall of the year to dig them up because it's like digging for buried treasure. It's fun to see what you've got underneath.
Well, I think that's going to do it for another episode.
Well, it's been fun to talk about planting everything from grass seed to trees to shrubs to roses. Yeah, I can't think of anything we haven't planted today.
We've covered a lot, but if people have any questions for you, how should they reach you?
Please feel free to email me. And if there's any issues with photos, send a photo along. My email address is donald.kinzler. I'll spell that Kinzler, donald.kinzler @ndsu.edu.
All right, and that's going to do it for another episode of Growing Together. I'm John Lamb.
And Don Kinzler.
And we'll talk to you later.
Growing Together, a gardening podcast, is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 at exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead.